Hi, I'm Chris Bowland. I'm an OpenShift Solution Architect with Red Hat, and today I'd like to show you how to integrate OpenShift Lightspeed with an external IDE such as Cursor. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what OpenShift Lightspeed is. Red Hat has integrated in Lightspeed as a GenAI assistant into the OpenShift console. And the idea is to make it easier for people using the console to get answers about OpenShift documentation, as well as what's going on within their cluster. So before we work on the integration bits with Cursor, I'd like to give you just a very brief tour of OpenShift Lightspeed in the console. So as I mentioned, it's able to access Red Hat documentation. So one of the things that I could do is ask questions such as, what is an OpenShift route? And so instead of having to go online and find all of that documentation and search through that documentation, I can use English language to query the documentation for me. Lightspeed will find that and then bring back the documentation, giving me examples, as you can see, telling me how to create routes, what the various spec components are in the YAML files, and it also gives me the source information for that. And you can do this across any of the Kubernetes or OpenShift concepts that you need to know more about. In addition to that, OpenShift Lightspeed also gives you the ability to look inside of your cluster, in the actual cluster that it's running in, and figure out what's going on there. So let's ask another question of OpenShift Lightspeed. We asked about routes earlier, sort of generally, what are they? Now I'd like to know, inside the OpenShift Lightspeed project, are there any routes available for me? And a route is a way to get traffic inside your OpenShift cluster, and we would have known that had we read all of the information that was returned to us in that first question. But as you can see now, we in fact do have a route to our OpenShift Lightspeed instance running in this cluster, and you can see the host name there. This is going to be important a little bit later on when we integrate in with our Cursor IDE. So we've talked briefly about how you can get access to documentation. We've looked a little bit about how you can actually see things that are going on in your cluster. Let's do one more example of that. So I'm going to ask about a particular project, the Lightspeed demo project, in just plain English. What's going on there? Lightspeed's able to actually look inside my cluster, look at that project, look at the objects in that project, and it looks like there's a problem. There's a crash loop backoff, an image pull backoff going on. It's been happening for a while now, really since I provisioned the cluster. And just as an example, I can now interrogate even further if I wanted to what was happening there, but we'll leave that for another day. One more really interesting and fun and useful feature with OpenShift Lightspeed is not only do you have access to Red Hat documentation, Kubernetes knowledge about general concept with OpenShift, not only do you have access to what's actually going on inside your cluster at the very moment you're asking those questions, you can also bring your own knowledge to OpenShift. And by your own knowledge, I mean your company's policies, procedures, manuals, how-tos, anything that you want to package up and make available to your OpenShift users, you can do that. You build a container image, you integrate that in with Lightspeed, and then you can ask questions that are specific to your organization about how to use OpenShift or really anything else that you've put inside that. So for example, we can ask a question like this. So Aegis Shield, clearly not a Kubernetes or an OpenShift concept. However, it's able to find the security protocols for Aegis Shield. And it's because I was able to create that knowledge base and include it inside Lightspeed for my particular cluster. I could also ask something like this. I can ask it about the monitoring standards for the Lighthouse project. Now, it's giving me answers, and these answers might be correct. We don't know at this particular time. We're trusting that the AI did the right thing in terms of bringing this up with our Lightspeed and our integration with the knowledge that we brought. Let's go check what we said. So we've got our memory pressures, our latency spikes with 500 milliseconds. Lots of knowledge there. Where did that come from? Well, I actually created some policy and procedure documents, which I included as part of my bring my own knowledge to OpenShift Lightspeed. And this is where the OpenShift Lightspeed got the information about Aegis Shield. This is where OpenShift Lightspeed got the information about Lighthouse monitoring. None of this exists in OpenShift by default. These standards, this knowledge is particular to my organization, and yet I was able to bundle that and make it available to everyone using Lightspeed so that when you're doing your own development there, you're able to conform to the correct standards for our organization in this OpenShift cluster. So the next thing then is, well, why would I want to integrate that in with Cursor? And a lot of times, administrators don't give developers access to that OpenShift console. We have all the right RBAC, all the right controls around it, and yet still developers are frequently not allowed to use the OpenShift console, which means that they would not be able to use OpenShift Lightspeed. However, now that we can actually integrate that with tools outside of our cluster, such as Cursor, our developers can now stay in the environment they're working in, stay in their Cursor IDE, writing code, deploying applications, and still have access to OpenShift Lightspeed. So let's see how that will actually work. So I brought up Cursor here, and this is my Cursor settings section in the IDE. And you can see under installed MCP servers, I've created an OpenShift Lightspeed MCP server integration point. And if we look at the configuration for that, there's a really good hint right there in the API URL. Do you remember that route that we looked at in the very beginning of this demo when I asked, hey, what routes are available in the OpenShift Lightspeed project? Well, this is that route. And so up above that, you can see that I'm actually running a local MCP server, and I'm integrating that in with Cursor, my IDE, and using the API provided by OpenShift Lightspeed, which means that when I want to come in and start using Lightspeed, I don't have to go to the console. Perhaps my admin's not letting me do that. I can still access that Lightspeed functionality right in my IDE. And so let's check out how that might work. First thing, I do want to notice that I am not logged in as the administrator. In the console, I was logged in as the administrator to show you that we can have that separation of powers, and it'll still work inside the IDE. So in the IDE, I'm actually user one, not an administrator. And so let's go ahead and start asking some questions about our OpenShift applications. All right, so I've asked Cursor to use Lightspeed and to tell me what pods are actually in the Aardvark project. We'll give it a moment to check this out. What Cursor is actually doing is using Claude, as you can see, the agent, the LLM that it is built to use is Claude, but then it's going to go and, in addition to that, use the MCP server to find OpenShift Lightspeed. And it tells me there's no pods in the Aardvark project, and I wonder why that is. So let's go back and look at our projects. And we don't have a Lightspeed project, so let's go ahead and fix that. So we've got a Lightspeed project now, but we haven't deployed anything yet. So before we ask any more about our particular project, let's run some of those earlier examples. So we wanted to know about the lighthouse monitoring standards. Can we find that out from our Cursor IDE? And so what we're doing is we're demonstrating that we're getting the same knowledge from Cursor using Lightspeed that we would if we were actually using the console. And remember, again, in this particular demo, I'm pretending that I don't have access to the console. I actually need to use Cursor to do that. And you can see we get that same answer. So we know that we're using OpenShift Lightspeed to get the answers that are particular for our organization. And you can imagine as a developer, this could be really handy. You'd be like, hey, what are the standards I need to write my code against? Or what happens if I need to troubleshoot outages? And in fact, let's ask another question about that. So again, I'm asking questions that are specific to my organization that don't have anything to do with OpenShift or Kubernetes by themselves. And in this particular case, I'm asking about the failover script for the Phoenix project. Let's go back and check our data and see if it got that answer right. So here's my Phoenix project disaster recovery. And you can see manual intervention. In the event of a total outage, the SRE will trigger the Phoenix Alpha failover script. That's exactly the answer that Cursor gave me, because Cursor is getting it from the same place. It's using OpenShift Lightspeed, but I don't have to be in the console to do that. Let's check out one more example of how we can actually use OpenShift Lightspeed outside of our OpenShift console environment as developers to make our lives easier, to increase our velocity, to be more productive. So what I'm going to do is actually deploy a fairly complex set of applications in this single deployment file. So I've called it Postgres query app deployment.yaml, which should give you a little bit of a clue as to what's going on. Let's start with the Postgres part first. So with this file, I'm going to create a Postgres virtual machine inside my OpenShift cluster. After the virtual machine is, or a Fedora virtual machine inside my OpenShift cluster. After I do that, I'm going to install a Postgres database into that virtual machine. I'm going to then modify the Postgres configuration so that I can access that virtual machine outside of the local VM that it's running on, set up all the appropriate firewall rules, make sure the database starts when the virtual machine starts, create the various Postgres and app users that I'd like to have. All of this stuff right here, this is all normal VM administrator stuff. Now we're doing it in an automated fashion through our cloud init functionality and through a deployment file. But this is really what VM administrators do all day long when they're creating new Fedora machines to run Postgres. But in addition to that, we're also doing some really interesting things with Kubernetes. So inside of the same deployment file, I'm going to create a Kubernetes secret. And with that Kubernetes secret, I'm going to create some SQL files. And when that virtual machine comes up, it's going to mount this secret, and then it's going to create tables and insert data into that virtual machine through this same automation process of having a single deployment file. And you can imagine that this could be multiple files, but regardless of whether it's one or multiple, we could put all of this in version control and therefore have declarative infrastructure with virtual machines as well as Kubernetes objects. We'll also create a Kubernetes service so that we can reach our virtual machine inside of our OpenShift cluster. We will also deploy a web application as a container. So this file is going to create a virtual machine and a container-based app in the same button press, essentially, in the same automation flow. And that web application is going to query my Postgres database inside my Fedora virtual machine, and then manifest all the data back out. So we're going to create a Postgres or a OpenShift service for that, and we'll create a route. Remember, we already talked about routes and how they get data into our cluster. We'll create an OpenShift route so that we can actually use our application. Now, in the interest of not burying the lead, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen coming up. So because the web application deploys very quickly, it's going to try and start querying the database right away with its health checks. But it takes a little bit of time for the Fedora virtual machine itself to boot up, and then to start Postgres, and then to load that data. So there's a little bit of a time sink issue with the way this is set up. And when I say issue, I mean that we will very briefly see some errors in the log files. And if we were to try to access the web app prior to it being ready, we would also receive an error on the web page. The reason this isn't a huge deal is that we're actually rolling on the right rails for Kubernetes. Kubernetes is essentially a state machine, and so we are going to wait in that reconciliation loop. Wait while those health checks continue to check to see if the database is ready. And once it's ready, then our application will start working. This is how Kubernetes is supposed to work anyway. But it gives us a really good chance with OpenShift Lightspeed as a developer to see what's going on right in our IDE. So let's go ahead and kick this off first. So what I'm doing is deploying that single deployment file. We're going to create the Fedora virtual machine, install Postgres, add data to the Postgres database, and at the same time, create my web app. So we'll kick this off, and then we're going to bounce back over to OpenShift Lightspeed in my Cursor IDE and see what's actually going on with that project. All right, so you can see we've created virtual machines and services and deployments and a route. All of that's happening. I'm now asking Cursor and OpenShift Lightspeed what's actually going on in that project. So it's not going to give me the secrets, because secrets could be potentially possible. Notice my query console. I've got one replica up, but it is not ready. So let's ask about that. And remember, I'm asking all of this through Lightspeed. I'm not running any OC commands here. This is integrated in with that AI assistant inside my OpenShift cluster, but I'm still doing this within Cursor as a developer, just doing it in my normal development environment. So you can see I'm now running in my probe failures on my health check. It's returning 503 errors. It's likely that my database isn't ready yet. And it gives me some next steps here as to things that I could do, other changes I might want to make in my YAML file, etc. Normal helpful stuff that you would expect from your Cursor IDE like this. But remember, it's integrated in with OpenShift Lightspeed, so that I actually have access into my cluster and what's going on inside that cluster. In fact, let's bounce back to the console and see what we've got going on there. Take a look at my workloads, the logs. All right, and as you can see, I initially had some 503 errors if you look at the top of the log, but they have finally started returning 200s. And that means my health check is now working. So that's great, but did the application itself actually deploy correctly? So one way we could test that, if we went back to our deployment and our workloads, we could use this icon right here and open up the OpenShift route, which is also listed here, and see that. But remember, we're pretending that we're developers and we don't have access to this console. I just wanted to show you what the logs were doing there. But let's go back to Cursor and ask it for the route to this. And again, it's using OpenShift Lightspeed to find out this information. It gives us the route, tells us a little bit about the HTTPS and the edge termination. I'm going to go ahead and open this up in my browser, make sure that this works for me. Looks like my query app came up. I've got a SQL editor. Those are at the top. Basically, the tables that I loaded. I can query my employees or my products. I can look into order details. I feel very comfortable that this application is now using that Postgres database app in my OpenShift cluster. But really, the real takeaway here is how we were able to integrate OpenShift Lightspeed into Cursor using an MCP server, so that as a developer, if I didn't have access to the OpenShift console, I still have access to everything that's going on within OpenShift Lightspeed in my IDE. And in fact, let's ask one more final question. This is from our Bring Our Own Knowledge sets, but so sticking with our route theme, for late night troubleshooting, what type of pizza goes best for a route? And there we go. We get our answer. I hope you enjoyed this. Happy using OpenShift Lightspeed. It should make you much more productive, regardless of whether you're using it in the OpenShift console or if you're using it outside of the console and integrated in with an IDE such as Cursor using an MCP server. Thank you.